Hello, Bob, also known as Robert Kemp. Thank you for being here with us, despite um, not being able to travel to Abu Dhabi, which we know is also a big pain for you. Anyhow, we're really glad that you could make it, at least for an online call, and give your personal warm words to the audience here in Abu Dhabi.
Well, I'm sad I can't be there. I have traveled to over 30 countries in this quest of benchmarking, and I have never been so much under the weather. But the good news is this message can be brought to you through new technology that we have today, namely distance learning and video conferencing. And it's probably becoming even accepted during benchmarking projects where people need to exchange information over long distances. So thank you for your attention, and best wishes for a very successful Congress. The theme is certainly engaging.
So, Bob, tell us more about your background and how and why you started benchmarking.
Well, I'm delighted. As people know, I worked for Xerox. I was in the logistics organization, and Xerox had popularized benchmarking. It became known, in particular, the manufacturing operation was pursuing what they called competitive benchmarking. That was a single-minded focus on the competition. Our own vice president of logistics learned about this and came back to our staff meeting, and he looked around the table and pointed a finger at me and said, look, you're relieved of all your duties for 6 months. I know that benchmarking is going to be demanded of all operations in the company, and we'd like to get a start on it. So go do some benchmarking and come back and show us what this amounts to. So we did some research to decide where we were going to benchmark, and we focused on improving operations in our warehouses. These are large, several 100,000 square feet buildings, and there has to be fairly state-of-the-art and efficient process for taking in materials, then putting it away, and then going and finding the items to fill customer orders. We then searched around for companies that did that similar kind of function, but not necessarily in our industry, because many types of organizations run similar warehouses. And at the top of the list out came this outdoor online catalog company called LL Bean. And we did some preliminary comparisons to them and found that their picking operation was 3 times faster than ours. So that was a compelling reason for us to want to go and visit them. And they did entertain a visit. And what we learned was 2 primary things. One of them was that they arranged their materials by velocity, meaning the fast movers were closest to the picking line. That was the first best practice. The second best practice then was a computer-directed picker travel, meaning he was directed to minimize his distance through the warehouse in finding the items that would go into a customer's order. Those were the 2 primary contributors to this 3 times faster overall picking operation. So one of the key learnings out of this, in addition to the best practices themselves, was an understanding that even though we were a copier company, we would not want to exactly copy the best practices. In fact, what we really wanted to do is have an understanding about what the best practices were, and then bring them back handing them off to the operational people, the people that are running the process, and saying, look, here's what they are. You understand them. Now go back creatively and innovatively implement them. And that was the landmark comparison that in fact was popularized then throughout all benchmarking circles.
What would you say is benchmarking for you?
Well, there is a formal definition. It's fairly wordy. It is the correct one. I won't cover it because it's kind of long, but let's get to the essence of what benchmarking is. And to do that, I'd like to mention that some time ago, a number of years ago, even before the benchmarking term was coined, a local humorist by the name of Will Rogers said, look, you must learn from others. You must learn from others because you can't possibly live long enough to make all the mistakes yourself. So a key, essence of benchmarking is learn from others. Now, I say that's fine. My more shortened version is finding and implementing best practices. That's the most cogent description of what benchmarking is all about. But in order to do that, you have to use a structured approach to change operations. Doing that, benchmarking has endured for these past several centuries as a method for making positive and unbiased change. And people that talk about making change, the thought leaders, say you really need to do three things to have successful change. First, you have to be able to show there is a need for change. Secondly, you have to determine what you want to change. And thirdly, you need to paint a picture so you can come back to the organization and say, here's what we're going to look like when we're done. Well, the need for change in the case of our benchmarking with LL Bean was the 3 times faster picking operation. The what to change was to minimize the picker's travel distance. And if we did benchmarking across all the operations of the warehouse, all the way from receiving, all the way through to shipping, then it put those best practices together, we could put a picture and be able to take it back to the organization and say, here's what we're going to look like when we're done. It is the epitome of a standard of excellence. It broke a paradigm in the sense that learning from others is now accepted in all economic sectors and around the world.
Bob, when you started benchmarking and when you made a methodology out of it, were you aware that you would change the management for the next decades?
The short and very cryptic answer is no. I never in my wildest imagination felt that it would be so extensively accepted and practiced. It was a real surprise to me. Nowadays, however, it's pretty well embedded in the suite of performance improvement tools that people have, and they can choose to use that. I normally find that it's embedded in the performance improvement process, which most companies have as part of their overall kit of tools to improve. It's not a fad. It's not here today, gone tomorrow. It's been around for over 30 years. And the reason is because it works. It has been successful, proven successful, and people turn to it time and time again.
Recently, we've seen a lot of new technologies coming up, and for sure, also benchmarking is in this environment with a lot of changes. How do you think technology will in the future influence benchmarking?
Well, there are several considerations. Number one is that we see the process pretty much remaining the same. The key steps are what to benchmark, whom to benchmark, and then going and accessing all the information sources in order to make sure that you had canvassed all the relevant databases. The process is going to remain the same, but the technology that supports that process are the things that are really going to make a difference in the future. It's the search for exemplary work process methods. That's what best practice benchmarking is all about. And all the electronics that we have, just like this distance learning video conferencing that we're using right now, is a key contributor to making benchmarking more efficient and in many instances possibly effective. And as well as then search engines to find where, in fact, we will either A, find companies that have best practices and we should research further, or B, understand actually what those best practices are in some depth. Those are things like diagramming software and other software to put together the baseline of yourself, which you in turn can then take to the best practice partner and then have that motivate them to want to participate because they will see they will also more than likely learn. So those are key technologies, but there's one more thing, and that is in the early days of benchmarking, studies were done, projects were done, but they were not cataloged. But today, there are available prepackaged benchmarking case studies. And these are another thing to go searching for. They typically reside in databases of professional associations and other similar kinds of organizations that have interest in their members knowing how to go out and improve. Excuse me. Yes.
So you were giving already a big view into the future when you started benchmarking the first time. So what were the biggest challenges you were encountering the first time you were executing benchmarking?
There was a huge disbelief and skepticism of this approach. When you go out and see an exemplary partner and then come back and tell your own organization that for all the years that they've been in existence, this other organization is picking their orders 3 times faster. That's a huge shock to the organizations. You got to realize that most of these are very, very proud people. They're proud of what they've done with their operation. And for them to all of a sudden find that somebody is doing something so significantly different that the shock is just something that is difficult to internalize. That's one of the reasons for one of the key learnings we came away with, and that is to make sure that there is adequate preparation before going out and doing benchmarking, so that you can ensure yourself that you have an exact one-for-one comparison, and you can not only describe what the differences were, but you can measure the differences and not have them be at all unambiguous. 3 times faster velocity, staging of materials, minimizing travel distance. Those are the kinds of things that you have to have documented extremely well. And I think probably there is increasingly a feeling that change is something that is always with us. Perhaps we're getting a little bit more used to that, but we really do need to focus on the mission critical processes and to obtain a true understanding of the exemplary best practices.
So one time, as you said, you were new to benchmarking as well, and we still have nowadays organizations which are just starting with benchmarking. Which hints do you have for them?
Well, there are 4 of them. First of all, I mentioned we were a copier company, but we also encourage people not to copy the best practices, but to bring those best practice understandings back to the organization and charge them to innovatively and creatively implement. In effect, even increasing the opportunity of benchmarking while they implement. That was a real key understanding. You don't just copy, you improve on what you've learned and even set yourself apart with that. The second one has to do with ensure that steps of the process are followed. I can't tell you how many times I've found people saying, look, we've done some benchmarking and we're dissatisfied with the results. And if you probe even just a little bit about, what were they benchmarking, whom were they benchmarking against, and what resources did they access, you'll find that some of those steps probably were not done with the thoroughness that should have been. So that's number 2. The third one is do not become obsessed with data. Your grade and probably effort in doing benchmarking is probably 85% concentrating on the understanding of the best practices, and only 15%, at least in my opinion, on getting performance measures that will substantiate the output of the best practices. People have a tendency to think this is a numbers game. It's not. A couple few key leading indicators, perhaps 3 to 6 and so forth. All we needed was a number that said, hey, the picking process was so many picks per man day. That was it, no more than that. That said, hey, there's 3 times faster. And then lastly, searching. You can certainly use Mr. Google, there's no question about that, but searching on the internet is like fishing in the ocean. It's probably going to give you what you want, but the level of thoroughness that you need to go through in actually searching, where you are really not an expert at doing that, I always recommend that people use the services of a research librarian. Those people know the databases that should be accessed. Those people know what are the key words to be used for the topic that you're researching, and they're the ones that should be part of the benchmarking process. So those are the 4 key lessons learned that we've had, and we stress them quite often.
So we are here right now in United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. What do you think? What makes this region special, and how does this apply to benchmarking?
That's a little bit of a challenge to answer with any real definitive response, because I probably would have to know more about the industries that are there and what they're striving for and the like. However, I have been to Abu Dhabi, I've been to Dubai several times, and I know that the UAE is becoming quite a high-tech industry location. The benchmarking really started in the high-tech industry. And there should be many opportunities to share and improve processes to improve business results in the UAE, just as there has been elsewhere in the world. So I would certainly simply encourage people there to start locally, benchmark with local partners, but at some point in time, they're going to have to go out and do a search of all the other potential operations that are similar to their own to make sure that they're not overlooking something elsewhere in the world.
So we are here now with our international benchmarking conference, with the Global Benchmarking Network, which has had a quite good development in the recent years. Also nowadays with the Global Benchmarking Award that we are promoting. Could you tell us, you as a founding member of the Global Benchmarking Network, how was it established and what was the mood at that time?
Well, the origins of the GBN, Global Benchmarking Network, where, as you mentioned, I was a founding member, was a situation where we had been doing some benchmarking in the US, but there had not been quite as much exposure to it in Europe or Southeast Asia. And I had visits by representatives of those countries, and they asked me to come and put on an awareness session in Manchester, England. And it turns out that they actually had to move the venue from where they originally thought would be adequate to using the Opera House in Manchester. It was literally the only location big enough to hold all the people that wanted to come and understand this new technique. So after those experiences, it became obvious that we were going to have to do something to satisfy this demand. We had a handful of representatives, I think there were 4 or 5 of us, that eventually assembled at a castle in Stratford, England, the hometown of Shakespeare, as you know, and held a meeting. One of the really interesting aspects of this meeting and where we met was when we went into the entryway, here was this big statue of a knight in shining silver armor, you know, with a sword, you know, in front of him, kind of either a greeter or a protector. We weren't quite sure. But anyway, the objective was to decide, you know, what was going to be the initiative for benchmarking. And motivated by these hugely successful workshops that we had. The consensus was that we form an organization that would spread the message of the art and science of benchmarking worldwide, and found competency centers in the countries that they represented. And I'm particularly pleased to look over my shoulder and see where we have upwards of 20 to 25 of those countries now represented in the GBN that stand ready and able to help the organizations in their countries and adapt benchmarking, obviously, to their needs. In addition to that, best practice benchmarking has been recognized by the American Society for Quality with a distinguished service medal as the new contribution to quality technology in pursuing the capture, exchange, and adoption of best practice worldwide to become the best of the best. And also, in retrospect, it was reassuring that this white knight in all its regalia was guarding that castle door where the meeting took place. So thank you very much. I trust the Congress has met people's expectations, and I hope to experience Abu Dhabi sometime in the future.
Yes, thank you.
The very best regards.
Thank you, Dr. Robert Camp, or also called Bob. Some say you are the inventor of benchmarking. How would you answer to this?
Well, I've been complimented in many instances with being called the father of benchmarking, and that may be a little bit of a stretch. Maybe something on the order of the uncle of benchmarking would be appropriate. But I appreciate it very much. I'm just extremely pleased with the success of this venture. And I am a proponent of it, as you can see. And I, it's used for your use.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Robert Camp.
Thank you.
All the best to the to America, and please get well soon.